Francisco, cuidado, desalojo por todos lados. San Francisco, cuidado.
Because this is so extreme right now that tenants really have nowhere else to go when they get these eviction notices or these threats, we are seeing more tenants who are willing to just stay and stick it out and fight.
San Francisco appears to have recovered gloriously from the recession. Employment and construction are on the rise, but so are evictions. While a new generation is striking it rich, many thousands of San Franciscans live in fear that the next piece of paper given to them will say they need to leave their home. At a historic gathering of tenants from across the city in February, residents shared their stories of resistance and renewed commitment to stay in San Francisco. A speaker at the citywide tenant convention was a resident who struggled to stay in her apartment last year, touched the hearts of San Franciscans. The eviction of Gumji Lee, her husband and disabled daughter, set off a public outcry against a growing problem of evictions.
So
for me coming here today, although I went through a lot of struggle and it was a really stressful time for me, but I never want anyone to go through what I've been through.
What's driving the eviction crisis are the growing prices for rents. The dramatic rise in rents is fueled by the sudden influx of wealth from San Francisco's current tech boom. Tyler McMillan is a tenants' rights lawyer.
One of the things that we've seen in San Francisco in the last couple of years is just an explosion in the rent level. And so the profit that you can make as a landlord has just become so enormous that the incentive to remove long-term tenants that are protected by rent control has become an extreme incentive.
Because of the state's Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act, there's no limit to the price landlords can set for a vacant unit, even rent-controlled units. People Power Media found there are many different scenarios that force tenants out of their apartment. Tenants living in buildings without rent control can see their rents increase dramatically month to month until they can no longer afford it. Many people who are priced out or are evicted have few options they can afford in the city, if any at all. Here's the executive director of a tenants' rights and counseling organization.
If you're real low income, often you become homeless because you can't just pack up and move. Other people have a little bit of a step up from that, and they leave San Francisco.
It's not just people with low incomes who are finding it hard to stay in San Francisco. People who are priced out are increasingly middle and working class. Of particular concern to housing advocates is the state's ELIS Act. This is one of the most widely used tools for evicting rent-controlled tenants who are paying rents below current market rate. The ELIS Act allows landlords to get out of the rental business. They can evict all the tenants in their building and sell the units. Once the apartments are sold, the amount of rent-controlled units in San Francisco is reduced because only buildings built before 1979 can have rent control. The state's Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act prohibits new units from being rent-controlled. Patricia Kerman is a senior on disability who's been living in the Mission District for 27 years. She received an ELIS Act eviction notice last August.
When I got the notice, I felt like everything collapsed on me. I'm on a fixed income, it's low income, I can live here, I have roommates, and I've been here so long under rent control that it was doable. But now the thoughts of being thrown out of here, I don't know where I'm going to go, and it's terrifying.
Patricia and her roommate are the only tenants left in the building. As a senior, she gets a year to move out. In the meantime, construction is already happening in other apartments.
After the neighbors moved out, they just started tearing all the flats apart. It's been nothing but noise. It's another way of trying to get me out. It's harassment.
All types of evictions are up nearly 60% since 2010. And last year, they were at their highest level since the tail end of the first dot-com boom in 2002. But housing counselors say the problem is much worse than the official numbers reflect. Tenants can be harassed or intimidated into leaving their apartments without being legally evicted. And these situations are not tracked by the rent board.
We call them constructive evictions, and sometimes we refer to it as self-evictions too, where a landlord gives basically an idle threat. They just either verbally or on paper say, hey, you got to get out. And tenants who don't know enough about their rights And often more vulnerable tenants like senior disabled folks or people who don't speak English or people that are in fear because they're undocumented. They just pack up and leave without getting good legal representation or understanding of their rights to stay. The other thing that happens is an actual threat of an Ellis Act eviction where they do file a certain amount of paperwork, but they never really intend to go through with it. And they just then use that as leverage to buy out the tenant. We're seeing these buyouts, we think probably about 3 to 1 in terms of the reported Ellis Act evictions.
Sarah says landlords are increasingly evicting for house rules violations, like having a pet or leaving things like shoes in the common area, even if the tenants pay all their rent. There are other emerging issues threatening tenants who once thought they were safe from evictions. Housing counselors are seeing evictions from buildings that aren't under rent control. At this building in the Tenderloin neighborhood, tenants who have lived here for over a decade, supported by Section 8 housing vouchers, are being evicted by the new owner. Jessica Cook is one of the residents who's being evicted.
I thought it was impossible because we never even saw the owner, so I didn't even know the building was getting sold. I'm 17, so I practically grew up around here, so it's been sort of my home, and I just don't want to move.
Section 8 is a program where the government pays landlords what it determines to be fair market rent for the unit. But market rent in San Francisco is now roughly double what the government is paying. So even though the government guarantees this rent for landlords, they can get more rent from market rate tenants. Thousands of people who depend on Section 8 to afford an apartment in San Francisco are at risk of losing their homes if their landlords pursue higher paying tenants. Being Section 8 tenants, these residents are having a hard time finding a new place that will take them in.
I have 225 Bailey waiting there. I have 225 King Street waiting there. I have 280 Fair Street last week waiting there. So one day, I hope I'm lucky. I can move.
The new owner, Ty Durekis, one of the executives of OnCare, a tech-based service that helps people manage their childcare businesses, has hired the law firm of Bornstein and Bornstein for the evictions. We reached him for comment, and he told us he's doing what he can to support the tenants with their relocation. Evictions are spreading beyond the eastern part of the city to other neighborhoods. Here's a counselor at Housing Rights Committee.
I have clients in an 11-unit building in the Sunset right now, which is unheard of. Sunset evictions for profit. Richmond, 3 buildings in the Richmond where the tenants are being evicted. We've got a building in the Bayview. We've got just buildings everywhere. I can't think of any part of the city where there's not evictions for profit taking place.
Tommy is also seeing that there are more and more large buildings where owners are evicting tenants so they can sell the units as tenancies in common or TICs. Buyers no longer have to take on the risk of a group loan when they buy the TIC. They can get an individual mortgage, called a fractional loan. These loans make units that used to be rented easier to buy and sell.
Now, people can actually go into a tenancy in common with a separate loan, with a separate mortgage for their unit. So these speculators and investors are taking advantage of that, and now they're going for the bigger buildings because whereas before with a 4-unit building, they could walk away with $1 million in profit. Now with a 25-unit building, they can walk away with millions and millions in profit. So really, it spells the death of San Francisco as we know it.
With rents so high and few affordable options within the city, tenants are increasingly fighting back. The eviction cases of the Lee family and that of Jeremy Michaels, a disabled senior with AIDS, were compelling personal stories that the community rallied behind. Last fall, housing groups formed the Anti-Displacement Coalition to advocate for new tenant protections. They decided the best way for people to be involved is to have a series of meetings throughout the city that culminated into a citywide tenant convention.
At the neighborhood conventions, those were focused on tenants coming out and brainstorming possible solutions to the housing crisis and proposing actual pieces of legislation or concepts of legislation. And each neighborhood convention recommended 2 or 3 to the citywide convention. And then today the process was that we looked at those recommendations from the neighborhoods and we discussed them and then at the end of the day, people rank them.
The tenant conventions were one of the many forms of collective actions by San Francisco residents and community groups on the growing problem of evictions. Citywide protests like this, neighborhood advocacy, and the tenant conventions have all brought tenant issues to the forefront at San Francisco's City Hall, and the city's representatives in the state legislature are bringing tenant concerns to Sacramento. Politicians have passed and are proposing a number of laws to curb evictions and displacement in reaction to community efforts.
We've made great strides in getting our representatives to listen to what's coming from the community, what we've been asking for in terms of solutions, and also to really pay attention to the urgency.
The San Francisco Board of Supervisors passed a series of measures that strengthen tenant protections, including allowing tenants to bring cases of harassment to the rent board and increasing the amount paid out to Ellis-acted tenants. But the most substantial changes in favor of tenants' rights would have to come from the state level because of the Costa-Hawkins and Ellis Act. It's these changes that this South of Market resident is hoping for. Teresa Dolalas and her family live in a building that keeps being sold. Each new owner has attempted to evict the tenants.
This is our fourth time, and we really do hope and pray, that we'll win again. We don't want to leave our homes. It's just we cannot afford anywhere else.
Teresa and her family have until the end of the year to vacate the apartment they've lived in for 36 years. She hopes to win her case against the eviction, or that there'll be new legislation to prevent it. A tenant movement from throughout California built up to a Renters' Day of Action in February. Here's a leader in this statewide fight.
It's really the first time in decades that tenants have mobilized on a large scale to go to Sacramento. Most of the time in Sacramento, the discussion is between landlord and real estate lobbyists and elected officials who they donated to. So our Renters' Day of Action was an attempt to start changing that dynamic.
Following the Renters' Day of Action, there were two bills introduced that attempted to amend the Ellis Act. Senator Mark Leno's bill would allow the city and county of San Francisco to prohibit an owner from Ellis-acting a building if owned for less than 5 years. Tenants Together is a co-sponsor of the Leno bill.
Our research shows that 3/4 of the Ellis Act evictions filed in San Francisco are by owners that have owned for less than 5 years.
Both of the bills have faced strong opposition from organizations representing landlords. We spoke with a representative of the San Francisco Apartment Association, which is one of the groups that oppose legislation related to the Ellis Act.
Through our research, we have found that many people who are invoking the Ellis Act are individual owners and not LLCs, speculators, or corporations. Many of them are doing so to move in family members or caregivers, and they've put their property in a trust or given a percentage of their property to a son or daughter within the past 5 years.
The Apartment Association agrees with tenant advocates that real estate speculation is a problem, but the association has very different views on the scale of the eviction problem in San Francisco.
The perspective of apartment owners in the San Francisco Apartment Association, respectfully, is that there is not an eviction crisis in San Francisco.
Rent board statistics show that Ellis Act evictions during the first dot-com boom were highest in 2000. But tenant advocates point to the fact that Ellis Act evictions are up dramatically over the past 4 years, increasing by more than 5 times. At the state level, the Leno bill reforming the Ellis Act is being amended as it goes through the legislative process. Ultimately, it's always going to be a challenge to advocate for tenant rights at the state and federal level, says this longtime housing advocate.
There's much more sensitivity to tenant issues in San Francisco at the local level than there is in the State of California Assembly, which pretty much is owned by Southern California real estate interests, and the federal government, which is as if the whole class of tenants don't even exist.
Housing policy at the state and federal level has historically prioritized ownership and property rights. These are ingrained in the Constitution, leading to an imbalance between the control of landlords and the vulnerability of tenants. Advocates keep pressing for local legislative changes to gain stability for tenants. For San Francisco's November ballot, advocates are working towards passing the anti-speculation tax, the initiative that gained the most votes at the citywide tenant convention. It would increase the real estate transfer tax for people who sell their property after owning it for less than 6 years. This is just one of the many ways that people are fighting to stay in San Francisco.
Quiero mis cosas, quiero mi unidad de regreso, quiero vivir en San Francisco honestamente y quiero estar aquí.
I want my things back, I want my unit, I want to live in San Francisco and I want to live honestly in the community. Sí se puede,
Gracias.
sí se puede, sí se puede.
This is Diane Ruiz for People Power Media.